Are we not? I mean, there's always something, right? Somebody could always pick at us for something. And you know who that person usually is? It's you, right? You could always figure out some reason that the spot you're in is your own damn fault. And if we need to find a reason why we're suffering, we just really don't have to work that hard or look that long. We'll find something. And so it is with these two stories at the beginning of our text, at the beginning of chapter 13. You know, Pilate mingled their blood with the sacrifices. Now, historically, there's no record of this having ever happened. Years later, they sacrifice a pig on the altar in order to really spite the people. Because, right, remember, swine is a forbidden animal. And blood is the kind of like the gift that we give back to God in animal sacrifice within the Hebrew tradition, right? You slaughter the animal and the food goes to the people, but the blood is given back to God. So it's like, it's against Mosaic law for you to eat the blood of an animal, right? That belongs to God, so when they sacrifice this animal, blah, blah, blah. But in this story, this seems like just straight up, right, this act of violence that's done unto these people. Well, yes, it could just be that. We could also think about it a little deeper. In Galilee, there's a resistance movement to occupation. There are active people that are what we might say bandits in English, like the two guys crucified on either side of Jesus. Bandits are pirates. They're people who steal from the empire, right? They're not just robbers. They steal from the empire, the governing body, the control. And so when a bandit, or let's say a Sicari, goes and murders a Roman centurion in order to have an act of defiance, the way that Rome deals with that is they bring in a garrison of soldiers and they call all the people to the city square wherever this thing happened, and they just say, who did it? Which one of you did it? Just step up. We'll take our vengeance out on you. No? Okay. You, and you. Up here, and we're going to kill all of you in front of everybody. Okay. Now you can go about your business, right? Because what's Rome's goal? Rome doesn't care about these people necessarily. Rome cares about power, about domination. And so, just think about this for a second. If you're somebody who hears about this horrible thing happening, you can, of course, blame empire, who's ultimately responsible. But you could just as easily blame that one Sicari who didn't own up and let 5 or 8 or 20 innocent people be murdered in his place. And you could feel equally justified in blaming that person for this suffering and miss the bigger picture of the existence of the occupation. Or maybe you could just blame all the Galileans because they live in this intermixing space with all these Gentiles amongst the faithful. And maybe it's their own damn fault for living in the wrong neighborhood. Maybe if you were really a person of faith, you'd live somewhere else where you weren't in all this contamination stuff. You know, maybe that's just what happens in Galilee. Now, you get this other story that Jesus brings in about the Tower of Siloam falling. Also, again, we don't have a historical record of this, but we know that it happens in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem's where all the holy people live. That's where all the people that are right with God and trying to be right with God and have the goal of being close to the temple so that they can pray every day are. Surely they don't deserve to be killed. And especially if it's a tower that falls, they're victims of an accident. This isn't even an act of violence. This is just a thing that no one deserved to have happened to them. Well, you can also ask this other question. Why did it fall? Did it fall because of shoddy workmanship? Did it fall because the contractor was skimming off the top and using substandard materials in the building? Did it fall because the wealthy continue to exploit loopholes in how they get wealth and the poor end up being the ones crushed? Did it fall because someone didn't follow procedure and took the bolts out of the crane too early? See, in all of these, we can find ways to orient towards blame. Find somebody who's responsible for the suffering that we see in the world. We don't even have to interrogate these things that hard before we start finding reasons to believe that somebody is actually responsible for this. It's somebody's fault that this happened. And we spend our time orienting to that. Now, why do we do that? What's the reason that feels valid enough to justify the suffering of other people? I meant that one as a hypothetical, but I love you for telling me that because we'll keep going there. See, Jesus is always asking us a different question. Jesus is at every turn asking us, yeah, but how are you going to respond? Yeah, your reasons. Yeah, your justifications. Yeah, your explanations. How are you going to respond? Trying to validate or make sense of or understand suffering is really just an attempt to separate ourselves from suffering. It's really just an attempt to find a way that we can know how suffering happens so that we can neatly avoid it. And this is kind of how we live, right? If I knew why it happened, it wouldn't happen to me. And we spend our whole life, Eric Kindom from Peace Lutheran gave me this imagery of building a dike. And we're just constantly building a dike to protect ourselves from the flood waters that are coming, the flood waters of suffering. And I love this image. I don't know if any of you have seen this, but there's this image that comes every once in a while when there's going to be a big flood, and somebody that everybody thinks is crazy goes out there and buys a bunch of bags and a truckload of sand, and they build a little 3-foot tall wall around their house. And then when the dike finally breaks and the water floods in and devastates the entire neighborhood, here's this guy standing on his lawn next to 2 feet of water all around him. And he looks so damn satisfied. It's always a dude, too. And he's like, yeah, who's right? And I remember our scripture from last week. See, your house is left to you, because you invested in building a dam around your one house, and now you live in a completely desolated neighborhood. Good job. What would it have taken for you to decide to invest with some neighbors in building a slightly larger dam? What would it have taken for you to decide months or years before to invest in the public services that build supports to protect your neighborhood and community? What would it have been like had you invested in this social safety net? But here's the reality of it. The floodwaters are eventually going to come. Maybe not today, maybe not in the same way for you that they'll come for somebody else, but suffering's going to happen in your life at some point, eventually. So why do we believe we're so righteous just because of our particular good fortune? Jesus is always asking us the question, but how are you going to respond when the floodwaters do come? How are you going to respond when the homes are decimated? How are you going to respond when your neighbor is laid bare and flat before you? And in order to make the point, he does this weird thing where he tells this parable, this story that seems like a non sequitur. It seems completely disconnected. To me, it did anyway. But it's a parable about fruitfulness. And it offers these 2 different responses to fruitfulness. Now, you've got the owner, right? And he's easy to make fun of. He's easy to dismiss, right? Because he's focused on maximizing productivity on his land. He's your standard straight-up capitalist. Maybe you could do that if you wanted, or you could say this is somebody who's responsible to a lot of people to provide food. We don't know. There's no more context. Well, we could imagine that this is somebody who has some connections and is trying to make sure that his vineyard is bearing fruit so that he can feed people he's responsible to. And he needs this to be productive. He needs this to happen, and it's not happening. And we could rightly say, you know, if you need this to be happening and this particular tree isn't bearing fruit, yeah, let's get it out of here. We need viable gifts being given into our community. We need people in leadership who have gifts to give, not people who are sitting around doing nothing, enfranchising only themselves. Or we could look at the gardener, right? He's focused on the productivity of this particular plant. He's our bleeding heart who thinks that everybody should get everything because they're a person, right? And we can dismiss him. He's also saying, well, maybe this particular plant needs some extra help. Because a fig tree is one of the hardiest fruit-bearing plants like in the world. It's one of those trees that can grow and bear fruit in rocky, nasty soil with just a trickle of water. It is actually this incredible, like almost like life-giving energy in this desert environment. The fig tree is a symbol of security, of God's providence, especially in Hebrew culture. Everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree. It's this image of what it means to be protected. It provides shade. It is leafy in this place that's very hot and overwhelming. Both of these characters are looking at this context of a lack of fruitfulness, a lack of gift giving coming from this living being, a lack of response, but they're choosing to orient differently. Now, sometimes I'm the gardener. Sometimes I look at somebody and I say, you need another chance. I know there was a lot of things in your way. This was hard for you today, this week, this year, this decade. I'm going to be generous, even towards the people that are unfruitful, the people that are stingy, the people that are callous. I've got it in me to dig around and give a little more. And sometimes I am the landowner. Sometimes I'm fed up. Sometimes I have come here looking for fruitfulness, looking for care, kindness, generosity, compassion, and I have found none time and time and time and time again. And I think that these people should be cut off from the people because they are already cut off from the people. They already don't care about the people, so throw them out of the garden. But often I am the unfruitful fig tree. Often I am supposed to be the symbol of peace and security and shade and sustenance, and I am not bearing the fruit. And I'm wondering, who am I going to meet? The gardener or the landowner in my place of unfruitfulness? Now, in this parable, who you think God is has everything to do with what you think about yourself. Jesus isn't telling this parable because one of these people is God and the other one is Jesus, contrary to centuries of interpretation of this parable. He's telling this parable to get us to think critically about deserved suffering. And he's asking us, but how are you going to respond? And I love parables because every time I read them, I hear and think something different about them. And this time, something really caught my eye. The gardener's response is to add manure to encourage fruitfulness. He's going to add poop to stimulate a response. Now, what's cool about this is in Greek, it's a direct translation, right? Manure is animal feces, and in the Greek, that's the word for it. It literally just means that. But in Greek, it has two very important connotations. One is stinky McNasty, right? Now, you got to remember that this is a society that has lots of animals in it. And especially in the cities, where does the poop go? Where does the poop go? It goes wherever the animal was. And where is the animal? In the street. So what is the street full of? It is full of poop. And what are you wearing on your feet? You are wearing sandals. So what is on your feet? Poop. You are tracking shit into everywhere you go, which is why washing your feet is so important. It's why a slave washes your feet, because they have to wash poop off of your feet. It's not dirt, it's not dust, it's poop. Poop everywhere. My kid's been reading Captain Underpants, so I apologize if I'm leaning in a little hard here. It is also exactly what you need to stimulate growth in a field that has been utilized over time. You want shepherds to bring sheep in to graze your fallow land so that they will poop all over it, because it adds essential nutrients to the soil. The ways that their guts digest it, break it down, and release some of that nitrogen that's then able to be absorbed by your crops. It is both worthless and critically important to life, which makes it such a great metaphor for suffering. Because suffering is just a bunch of shit in the wrong place. It contaminates everything. And it makes everything so much harder and so much worse. And it pushes people away because they don't know how to be with it. They don't know how to deal with it. You don't know how to deal with it. It's just a bunch of shit. Asking why we suffer just leads us to separate from other people. It leads us to judge others, to condemn others, I should say, and to condemn ourselves. However, when applied rightly, our suffering produces a profound humility in us, because we realize that everyone suffers, and suffering is shit, and it pushes everyone away. And our heart breaks when we realize that we have not even begun to touch the reality of the suffering of some of the people that we know. Some of the loss, some of the degradation, some of the violence that has happened to people that we love. When we start to open our hearts to the reality of the shit that some of our beloveds walk through, it changes us. It grows us. It starts to help us become fruitful in love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. It can give us perspective and insight that can lead us to become gift givers. Can we take the shit of the world, which is common to all, and use it to become fruitful? Jesus is always asking you, but how are you going to respond? He never explains suffering. He always just walks into it. And he touches the hand. He raises the back. He walks with the people that are stuck in the shit. God is always going to walk beside us. God is always going to be with us. The ask is not why it's happening. The ask is always, how are we going to respond?